policies were. And then, seeing the very real impacts of our trade policy, of IMF conditions that you all know and love, I felt the need to see where those policies were emanating from, as many do, and came to DC, as many do, to try to change those. But then it still wasn't content, because as I would be in lobby visits with someone, or be in discussions with the IMF and asking why they're so intransigent on structural adjustment, or why our trade policy had not changed since 1994, I would get a slew of economic jargon and graphs that I just did not understand, and that we were not talking the same language. So I felt like I needed to go learn that language, and so I went to the Kennedy School to go learn their language, essentially. And there, one of the languages I studied was that of GDP, gross domestic product, and so that I could, I felt it seems like one needs to understand the predominant discourse to be able to alter it. And GDP certainly is the predominant discourse, and we've got a plan for altering it, and that's essentially the talk today. So, 21st century GDP, this is I should note, this is a presentation that my thesis partner and I did for last year during shopping around the Kennedy School. His name is Justin Zorn, and we actually did this whole project for our clients, the way theses go in the Kennedy Schools. You do it for a client. So our client was Congressman Hanson Clark, as represented from Detroit, and a really great man, in addition to a pretty cool policymaker. And one of his aspects of coolness was that he was willing to take this under his wing. And so I'm going to give a little bit of the history first off, of what GDP is, what some of the major problems are, and then some proposed solutions we've got. How much have you guys delved into gross domestic product issues?
A little bit. The group has been concerned that GDP is not the proper measure.
Yeah.
Especially because it doesn't account for anything in the environment.
Yeah.
And that's a huge concern for a lot of people. We had one meeting with, there was an institute that was set up by Congress a number of years ago, the American something Institute. I'm not remembering their name now. But they are sort of trying to set up these measures that aren't GDP, but that would take...
The State of America? The State of America?
The State of America, that's it. So we did have a meeting with the State of America to talk about what they are doing. But it's an area of interest for a lot of people. So the Center of Concern has been doing a lot of thinking about it as well.
For years, we've worked with how women's work and whatever is counted in that. And it's more than just women, but that's how I came at it.
Yeah.
So, there's some. Definitely,
both environment and disproportionately women's work is something we accounted for as well. So, I'll do some brief background in case the others aren't quite aware. How did we get to where we are now? GDP, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is the government body that computes GDP, proclaimed it as one of the 20th century's greatest achievements, one of the greatest policy achievements of the 20th century. And in terms of impact, it's hard to contest that. It's used all over the place. It's used to describe, of course, business cycles. Every quarter, everyone looks at what the GDP numbers are doing. But in addition to that, that's closer to its original purpose of how much production have we undergone in the last quarter. It's also been used, increasingly as over decades as a rubric of government performance. It's a political rubric. How much if a president in their 4 years saw GDP decline or not grow as fast as more likely, that's going to be they're going to be in some hot water for the election, and so it's seen as the fruits of their efforts, and living standards overall. We compare the United States to other countries. The IMF and the World Bank compare developing countries to other developing countries, all using GDP, and we compare ourselves to our past using GDP, saying we've improved by this much in terms of living standards. And so it's really become a proxy for these much bigger aspects of welfare rather than just business cycles. The original purpose of GDP was much more narrow, though. It was simply tracking total economic activity. It was created amidst the Great Depression, Everyone knew that the economy was in trouble and economic production was way down, jobs were way down. But the only way they had to really track that were really rudimentary measures, such as actually counting like the number of freight cars on a train that were going out of the station in a given year. So that was not at all. There was no measure, no way of saying here's how well we're doing as an economy. And so they Congress tasked a young enterprising economist called Simon Kuznets with the task of coming up with a measure. And this took place in the same time period that Keynesianism, Keynesianism was slightly later, but Keynesianism came into the fore as well. And as I won't really get into fully here unless you want to at some point, GDP kind of provided the anatomy for the physiology of Keynesianism. It provided the tools through which Keynesianism could measure how much spending affected output. And so it took the fore there. But so the initial purpose, though, was simply just tracking, how much output do we have as an economy. And so they do that by taking a broad range of economic data, and they would combine that all into a single number. It's a very complicated number, and it's the measures for how you get to that number have changed actually over the years. But at the end of the day, you have a single number, of course. Just to show how far we've come, though, the original creator, the father of GDP, Simon Kuznets, has a famous quote. He said in the 40s, when he started to see even then that GDP was being used, the purpose was creeping, and that it was being used for something it was not meant for. And he said, the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income, meaning, of course, his very own measure of GDP. And that's unfortunately precisely the inference that we've been making for the subsequent 8 decades, and today, that national income is welfare. Policymakers might not say that precise sentence, but again, in the ways I just mentioned, is that it is used as a rubric of political success and as a rubric of living standards. And so, our main concern here, our main premise, is that we get what we measure. I just came from public policy school, and it's obsessed with measurement, and and there's a reason for that, because policy moves around measurements, as we all know. And so we get what we measure, and if we are not measuring that which we seek to get, well, then we're going to get the wrong things. And so it's important to look at something you already alluded to. What are the primary gaps between what we seek to get and what we are measuring with GDP? So I would break this down into 3 broad categories of gaps in this beautiful chart. So first off, as you mentioned already, GDP was never set up to measure environmental welfare or social welfare. It is, people often talk about all that we value in terms of 3 main terms: economic, environmental, and social. It's just economic. And so it's not at all concerned. It's never tried to be concerned. If you talk to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, they'll say, well, yeah, it was never meant to be this. It was never meant to be accounting for environmental and social welfare. That's a concern when those things that we measure as valuable in terms of the environment or social goods are either just not taken into account at all, like GDP is agnostic as to whether or not they're performing well, or even worse, GDP might be perversely correlated with them, and the environment, of course, is a very clear sign of that. Right. One concrete example you could use, say you're an urban planner, and you're looking at seeing something similar to that, massive urban sprawl. People waiting for hours each day on commute to try to get through crowded highways. The sky is cluttered with smog. Your idea to improve this might be something like a light rail project. Your light rail project, however, would actually potentially bring down GDP. Why? Because while those cars are emitting smog into the air, they're also consuming gasoline. The consumption of auto parts that had to go into the cars, the consumption of extra cars themselves, not to mention the mini markets and malls that spring up around subdivisions. That basically there's a huge there's a mini economy essentially around the fact that we have urban sprawl. If you eliminate that, then you've brought down our measure of success, GDP. So that's a perverse correlation with both smog, which we'd like to seek to eliminate, commuting time, which we'd like to seek to eliminate. And that brings up, the commuting time one actually brings up another really important thing that GDP completely leaves out. Sometimes it's perversely correlated with it, sometimes it's just agnostic, which is leisure time. If you would compare the United States with France, it wouldn't really be, GDP is going to be, it's large in the U.S. obviously for a lot of reasons, but one reason it would be, even if you take like a city of equivalent size in France and the United States, would be that people are working 40 plus hours here, and in this city it's like 60 plus hours, and in France it's, what is it, 30, 32, something like that. And so proposals, there are a lot of proposals on the table right now to transfer to a new economy that would say, look, if we were going to try to employ as many people as we like to employ, we need to all start working less. Well, those proposals would be registered as a negative on GDP because we simply, of course, will be reducing the output. So there's no value whatsoever placed on leisure time, whereas most humans like to do somewhat value their leisure. Public parks, if you'd like to create a public park instead of that highway system, again, there's not really any value assigned to that. So that's all environment and social things. Moving on to the next broad category, even if we throw out the environment, throw out social welfare, insofar as it doesn't touch economic welfare. We're only concerned now with the environment insofar as it actually is an input into economic production. Yeah. Still, then you have a major gap in GDP and what most people consider to be welfare in that it does not account at all for future potential. It is not. It's a cash flow statement, not a statement of assets. It's not how much you've got in the bank, it's how much you're spending in a given day. Most people think that they should probably consider how much they've got in the bank. As an economy, we probably want to consider how many resources we have for the future for ourselves and our children. Seems obvious, yet not accounted for. We do account for this in one way, one predominant way, which is net domestic product, which is not GDP, it's an alternative measure, would account for the degree to which machines degrade, depreciation, and so you just take the replacement cost, what it would take to bring the machine back up to a new working standard, and take that out of your production. You can do similar things with forests. We obviously need forests for the future, if nothing more for the sheer timber, much less the ecosystem services provided, much less the enjoyment you might get out of a forest. And so that future economic output that we are not getting because we've used it today, it should be taken out of our measure if we're going to account for the resources we have left. Another way to think about future potential is to think about not just how is it that how is what we're using up today going to affect our ability to produce tomorrow, but also how is what we're using up today going to cause economic damage tomorrow. And climate change, of course, is one of the key things to think about here. You can think of an appropriate level of carbon in the atmosphere as yet another reservoir resources. Not carbon-free, but like a low-carbon atmosphere would be another reservoir. To the extent to which we throw carbon into the atmosphere, there's a correlated economic cost that we can assume as we see more severe weather, more droughts in agriculture, and sea levels rise. So that should be registered, even if you're not even talking about how much we love bunnies and forests. You're purely talking about the economic outcomes. You should account for that. Mm-hmm. And the last one, the last three of the third categories, even if you throw out the future and you throw out environment and society, and you're only concerned with the economy in this year, the exchange of goods in this year, then you still have to be concerned with what you raised earlier, household-produced goods or other goods produced in the informal economy, goods that are non-market. And as we outsource family-cooked dinners to restaurants, GDP goes up. But is that necessarily progress? Not everyone would see it that way. As we have fewer parents at home and more people just depending on daycare, obviously many families need to do that, but is that really what we want? Not everyone would see it that way. And so those non-market goods need to be accounted for because they really are, just on pure economic terms, a provision of a good or service. And then one of the biggest factors in this category is just simply inequality. GDP makes no attempt to account for inequality. As if the richest person in the world, in the U.S., gets a bunch richer, GDP goes up just the same amount as if the poorest person does. And actually, you've seen as GDP has been rising over the last decade, median wages have been falling. That is for the majority, the real incomes have been falling. You don't see that accounted for in GDP because, of course, more wealth has been accruing to the top, as we all know. Even on a purely economic basis, I mean, economists do agree that a dollar for the richest person is not worth the same as a dollar for the poorest person. It's the diminishing marginal utility of income, that as you have more income, each additional dollar becomes less and less worthwhile. And so even on purely economic grounds, we should be adjusting for that in whatever our measure is. So those are the three main gaps that I would throw out there between that would cause a policymaker, if she or he were looking straight to GDP, to implement actually perverse policies. One of the best examples of this is the Deepwater Horizon tragedy. Right after this happened, well, it wasn't right after, but sometime after this happened, after the explosion and the oil spill, the largest single oil spill in our history, the JP Morgan analysts looked at this and determined that the net result of the Deepwater Horizon tragedy would be an increase in GDP. And the reason for that is that the amount spent on cleanup would outweigh the losses to fishery, tourism, or any other losses. So it's actually a net gain. There's been, of course, much momentum for change around this. We are building on decades of efforts to try to change GDP, and we're not actually proposing anything new. We're basically amalgamating various efforts that we've seen. There's been the reasons for this momentum come from one is that we've really been able to develop much more advanced data gathering. We have, for example, you mentioned household labor. We now have time use surveys where households are asked to fill out how much time did you spend cooking, how much time did you, without that data, it's really hard to determine how much is the value of a home cooked meal for an average family. We now have that data. We have new methods that have been developed to assess the wealth of a forest, for example. So I'm not suggesting that that's an agreed upon number. There's a huge amount of controversy on how exactly one should do that, and which method you should use, but before that wasn't even really talked about. In the last several decades, we've come a long way. In addition, and partly because of that, there's been a proliferation of alternative indicators suggested, of concrete alternatives that have names. At the end, I can show you. Actually, I'll just show you now. Let's see here. Right there you go. These are all alternative indicators that have been proposed, starting with Bhutan's and gross national happiness in 1972. I'll go back over a few of these in detail in a second, but just to show you how and the rate actually at which these are proposed has been increasing.
Yeah, Maryland actually has I don't know if they call it alternative, but
it is, yeah, the Genuine Progress Index,
yeah.
And that's one of the ones that we actually built off of.
Okay.
So that's a really good point, is that governments have been increasing. This isn't just NGOs saying we should do this, or economists saying we should do this. This is governments doing it. Maryland now measures the Genuine Progress Index indicated right next to GDP, and I'll show you graphs of how the two divide here in a second. But in addition to that, Vermont actually I'm not sure if it's in the final stages or not, but they're making headway to an alternative indicator as well, becoming the second state. And in addition, at the federal level, not in the U.S. but in other countries in Europe, there's been quite a bit of movement on this. Stiglitz led a commission that was called for by French President Sarkozy to study basically the shortcomings of GDP and make recommendations for alternative measures. And as a result, Germany, France, and the UK, their statistical bureaus of each of those countries is now starting to compute alternative measures. It's not yet sure which one they'll use or what it will look like, if they'll do a dashboard or one number, but they're doing it. So again, none of this is all within the last 5 years. So there's quite a bit of momentum right now. I'd be very surprised if we didn't see an alternative indicator in the United States in the next decade or two. So it's incumbent on us to shape what that looks like. In addition, I think the discourse about how pitiful of a indicator GDP is of what we're trying to measure has become much more pronounced. A lot of people get this. We went around and did interviews with a wide spectrum from left to right on the political spectrum, and a wide, and this gets to my last point as well, and very ideologically diverse group of people gets this. Even the Heritage Foundation, for reasons I'll go into in a little bit, really was like, thought we should significantly change GDP. So the American Enterprise Institute, from them the whole way to the Institute for Policy Studies, and many in the middle. And so you've got not exactly a consensus on the details, but a consensus on the broader impetus for change. But we've got some obstacles. First, as kind of alluded to, the methodological uncertainty. Just how do you value a forest? Say, there's several, I can think of 3 things that a forest might give us. For one is timber. The timber should be fairly easy to value. If you're not, before it's cut down, you just say what's the going market rate of timber. But what about the ecosystem services provided? What about the extent to which the forest filters out carbon, or provides other environmental services, filtering out our groundwater, for example? That's a little harder, and there's a lot of methods about it, but there's not agreement. Further out yet, what about the enjoyment value? One has that for forest. There's a concept in economics called the existence value. The idea that the forest exists is probably worth something, even if you never see it. What's that worth? There's a wide range of ideas on how to value that. Second main obstacle is institutional inertia. There's just, our government moves slowly, especially at the federal level. The GDP has been calculated for 8 decades now. It's very difficult to move something that's not moved a lot for 8 decades. In addition, interest group opposition. There are some, while I mentioned an ideologically diverse coalition, there are some indeed more narrow economic interests that would be probably opposed to any new measure. For example, if carbon was somehow included, the coal industry, I don't see any reason why they would support this. So our objectives here, and I won't spend equal time on all of them. I'll spend more time, I think, on the indicators, so that's more probably your interests. Our objectives were threefold. One is to come up with alternative indicators, not all the details, but broad parameters of them. The institutions that could compute them, and navigate the political interests so that it could actually be something tenable, that can actually move forward rather than just a pie-in-the-sky idea. Here's who we interviewed. There's a bunch of people from a bunch of government agencies and NGOs, from left to right, advocacy groups. So on indicators, there are several steps we had, several decision points we had to make when looking at what sort of indicators should we have to supplement or replace GDP. The first one is, do we want an aggregated indicator that computes to one final number like GDP does, or a disaggregated dashboard? And you mentioned the State of the USA, which is a dashboard approach. It looks like that. You have one knob for, it could be timber. You have another knob for, or you could have a knob more generally for force. You could have a knob for household labor, etc. Or you could smash all that together through some sort of calculation into the genuine progress indicator, which is what Maryland uses. There you can see how this is the graph that you can look at with Maryland. You can say, well, look, our gross domestic product has been rising and rising and rising. It looks like we've been doing better, but something's wrong because according to the genuine progress indicator, we haven't grown since 1970. In fact, we've been going downhill. So there's a huge gap there, and that right there, I mean, like it's a snapshot of the problem. It provides in an instant to the broader public what the problem might be with GDP and the idea that we should have an alternative solution. By contrast, if you look at the vision, the image on the right, and you look at that and you're like, well, what's wrong? It's really hard to get a takeaway and to say, here's the problem and here's why we need to change it. So for us, we did lean towards the aggregated indicator, mainly because it has that narrative potency to actually change the narrative. We believe that indicators don't just influence policy simply by, it's not usually actually by saying like, X policy has to move GDP by Y amount. That's rarely done. It's usually just it's just the broader policy-making narrative, like did this policy improve our economy or not? Well, what does improve our economy mean? We want to redefine what that means. And so the singular indicator made sense. Also, you can break down a singular indicator into its composite parts. There's no reason you couldn't do both and we think that that's the best way to go. Another major decision point is, well, looking back at the list of indicators that have been developed thus far, you have a wide range of different kinds of indicators, but I would group them into three main parts, three main categories. The first is the subjective indicators. The most famous of these would be the gross national happiness indicator used by Bhutan. First proposed by Bhutan in 1972, but it was mainly just kind of like a nominal proposal for a couple decades, but then in the last decade, they've actually done a survey, a very, very extensive, it's a 5.5-hour survey. I went through all the questions, and it's like you fill this thing out, and then they can come out with a number for how happy the population is. It has everything up there from like how well do you get along with your neighbors to when you wake up in the morning, how do you feel? The one Bhutan is actually very Bhutan dependent, as well as a lot of cultural questions that don't quite translate. But the basic logic of it is appealing. Is that if you want to know how well we're doing, you should just ask people. An individual is in the best position to know how well she or he is doing. Why not just ask them? That is really appealing. If all you're trying to get at is actually happiness, then that would make a lot of sense. We're actually trying, on our proposal, we're trying for something slightly different. We want to try to change policy. We want policy to conform to the values that most people would have. And so we're interested in policy's impacts on happiness, not all realms of happiness. Happiness can vary with the weather, how well your sports team did, marital infidelity. None of those things probably could be blamed on the government. And so we're trying to constrain ourselves to policy-linked happiness. To get to that, there are two other broad categories. One is composite indicators. Human Development Index is the best known example of that. The United Nations has been using that since the 90s, proposed by Marty Sen. And the Human Development Index, what it does is it takes three categories. It says these are really important to us: health, education, and income. And it says how well are you doing? It's a relative thing. How well are you doing relative to some standard on health? How well on education? How well on income, which is actually GDP? And then it smashes them all together. That creates an issue in that how do you decide when you smash them together how much you value income versus education versus health? And that's what the Human Development Index does, and what a lot of the composite style indicators do is just give some equal weights. If you're in the absence of knowledge of how much we value them, then yeah, that makes sense. Or it's the best way to go. But it doesn't really. There's no real logic to it. It's fairly arbitrary to assume that all of your different categories are equally relevant to overall welfare. So that's a concern for us. And the last one is, like Maryland's Genuine Progress Indicator, is adjusted GDP. And here what you do, this is the most complex one, you assign values. You assign prices, essentially. What is the price on that forest timber or the ecosystem services? What is the value that the woman is providing in the home that she's not getting any income at the workplace? What is the value of having a relatively more equal income spread rather than a really unequal one? You assign prices to everything, and then the prices the dollar is the unit of measurement, and so the dollar itself tells you how things combine because it's automatically got a unit, as opposed to the unit just simply being equal arbitrary weights for each one. So this also brings a lot of that first obstacle I mentioned of methodological uncertainty, because then it puts all that much more weight on getting the prices right. Whereas the Human Development Index is attractive because it's simpler. You just say, well, we don't know exactly how we value these different things. We're just going to assign arbitrary weights, but then we don't have to have big debates on the value of health. We just say, are you doing relatively good or bad? For us, we think though it's going to be impossible for a while to get perfect prices, we should start with that. We should go down that road. When GDP was actually first proposed, they didn't. It was a fairly crude measure as well. They've developed it through iterations. Every quarter, actually, the BEA modifies somewhat how it calculates GDP. So it's gone through about 320 different changes from its initial proposal. Not huge ones like we're talking about, but the point is that you can develop these things over time. So our preferences for adjusted GDP. Once again, one of the clearest indications of this would be like, say, one policymaker A is like, we should really tap the Alaska National Wildlife Reserve for oil. And because that's going to increase our GDP and by 300 million. There's two responses you come up with. If you had a composite indicator, you could say, well, it might increase our GDP by 300 million, but it's going to lower our HDI from an 8 to a 6.7. If you have adjusted GDP, you could say it's actually not going to raise our GDP by 300 million. It's going to lower our GPI. It's going to lower our GPI by 125 million. And we feel like by keeping it in the same unit of measurement as GDP, it just has that much more punch to it, and again can change the conversation better.
Yeah.
This is the nutshell. I won't go into each of the bullet points here. It's prettier to see the sausage than its composite parts, probably. But this is essentially what we're proposing. We decided that we went with the GPI style, what Maryland has done, and assign values to that which is not in GDP but should be, and that which is in GDP but should not be, we take out. And so this is, just to give you the overall rubric, what we've done here is taken GDP itself and not gotten rid of it, because we do think it actually is useful for the original narrow purpose it was meant for, which is measuring like business cycles, measuring just aggregate output in a given economic year. So we would collapse that down to G1, and then we propose 4 other measures, G2, G3, G4, and G5, in much the same way that for unemployment we have U1 through U6. You just heard this month actually there was a bad jobs report, right? Well, all the headlines said it's a bad jobs report. If you would have just looked at the GDP equivalent of unemployment, you would have said it's a good jobs report because it went up. U3 went up, it went down actually. Unemployment overall went down. Went from I think 8.3% to 8.1%. So why is it that everyone said it was bad? Well, it's because U6 went up, which is that more and more people just simply gave up. They gave up searching. Why did we know that? Because we had U6. We could say the reason that that unemployment rate went down was because people just drew themselves out of the workforce completely. So it actually did influence the narrative and influence the takeaway, the headline that people reported. We'd like to do the same through this model. So I'll just briefly go through what each of these are. This corresponds with the 3 main gaps that I mentioned earlier. So I'll start with the things that are closest to what GDP tries to measure and then work out. So G2 would start with GDP, as they all do, this one would try to account for current year economic value, and so it's this year's purchasing power satisfaction is the way we frame that. So it's the closest to what GDP is going for. But what it does is it discounts for income inequality, as I mentioned, so that there's an array of calculations you can use to do that, but essentially so that $1 for a poor person is worth more than $1 for a rich person. Actually, debt finance consumption as well. We believe above a certain threshold, over the last decade or so, debt-based consumption has really what's been fueling our economy. We've been consuming inordinately high levels of based on debt. Parents and grandparents' generations never had nearly as much debt as we have, and above a certain threshold, that's probably we would start discounting that consumption. The value of household labor, as we've talked about several times, also other non-market laborers such as that performed in the informal sector, volunteers, NGOs, and others. And there's several other things that we talk about there. So that's essentially G2. That's current year. It's current year prosperity. G3 would be taking into account that all the stocks that I mentioned, that the assets that are a reservoir of being able to produce in the future. And so we take into, that's what's commonly referred to as capital, your reservoir of goods. And so this one actually starts with G2. All of these are cumulative. So it starts with what I just described, having already accounted for inequality and household labor, etc. We would then take away the changes in the stocks of physical capital, or take away or add stocks in physical capital, which would be like machinery, human capital, which would be like health and education levels at the margins, financial capital, social capital, intellectual capital. Each of those has a huge literature on it. So social capital alone, is something that a variety of scholars have been developing. But the basic idea is that we see lower levels of suicide, lower levels of mental illness, lower levels of depression. Lower levels of other maladies through more cohesive communities. And they've actually started to develop ways to measure that. How cohesive is your community? Do you actually associate with your neighbors? Do you have friends? Those sorts of things. And so we think these are actually valuable. And it's been shown that those actually can be an input to output, to economic output. That if we are feeling depressed, that's actually a drain on the system rather than a contribution to it. So there's all manner of debate that can be had about each one of these little bullet points, but that's essentially what it tries to do. Another thing that I would mention here is that this also does take into account changes in the natural capital stock, which is such as the direct land or air or water that we have, in addition to subsoil minerals, and also the prospective damage that would be incurred by the amount of carbon we put out into the atmosphere that year. So this would essentially put a price on carbon. That is G3, wealth. To move to G4, forget temporarily what I said about G3 and go back to where I was with G2. So you start with G2 and you either move down or you move across. So because this is back in current year. We're not talking about the future anymore. We're still in current year, but we've added in social and environmental factors as well. Not even ones that have to be justified somehow as an input to the economy, but just for their own sake, like smog or commuting time, are something we value. We would attach value to. So you start with G2 and you add in leisure time, as I mentioned we don't account for, community cohesion, preventative health measures. You would take out things like smog, take out things like commuting time, crime, etc. And you would have, this is probably the closest one we get to happiness. It's just like, it's not, usually happiness, people don't actually, studies have shown people are fairly short-sighted in their happiness. It's not really about the future, it's about the current year, and so this would be our happiness measure, taking into account all things economic, social, and environmental. Then if you combine them all together, G2 plus G3 plus G4, you get to G5, and that is just overall well-being. It is GDP accounting for the gaps in current year economic prosperity, accounting for social and environmental variables as well, and accounting for future, accounting for how much wealth we have to be able to be happy and have high welfare in the future. So that is that. This, of course, is much more complex than this little chart can show it, but we can go into some details if you want. Yeah?
Did you want to wait till the end for comments? But what I wanted to ask you is related to this part.
Let's go ahead.
Well, some of this reminds me of Caroline Moser. Do you know her work?
No.
She I wish I could remember the name of the book, but one of the study that she did, and it was all social, it wasn't environmental, and it didn't go nearly into this detail, and it was looking at as things are now. Mm-hmm. She was looking at communities, and the income of the people in the communities mattered less than, say, for instance, you could make a lot less money if you had good public transportation, childcare, affordable housing, and those sorts of things. Well, that's pretty obvious, but because of all the economic work that's been done forever, we never factored those things in as being important. And she was showing how important all those things were, and she didn't use the word happiness, but to the well-being, I guess, of communities. And she was she taught for many years at the London School of Economics, and came here in Washington thinking she could change the World Bank, and it didn't work. But she did work on gender for them for a while, and that was an unhappy ending. But anyway, if you see her name, again, it's just that whole idea of looking at existing communities and looking at the well-being of those communities in terms of some of the things you're talking about. So I'm sitting here getting all excited remembering those conversations.
No, that's a lot of this grows out of that. A lot of this grows out of how communities define it. That does raise one other question that becomes a big challenge: is like, do we all value the same things equally? Like some communities may disproportionately value certain things differently. Certainly, Bhutan has expressed its values, and that's so one approach would be like, well, to each her own. Like let's each disaggregate according to what our community values. But then, how far do you disaggregate? Each of the four of us in this room would value things four different ways. So how at some point we need to have an indicator. Also, we'd like to have comparability between indicators. We would like to say like both between time and space. So like we would like to not change this so much every year that we can compare compare 2012 with 2022. We'd like to be able to compare the United States with Bhutan probably. And so these are comparability becomes a big issue when you're creating your indicators. So that's the nutshell. Those are the four new ones that would join GDP. And so the question of, how do we assign prices to all of this? Just in terms of our proposal, since we were doing this actually for a member of Congress, and actually for legislation. We have a bill, which I'll show in a second. The solution here is we didn't really want Congress debating the value of a forest, or any of these things actually. So we thought we should probably have a smaller commission be looking at that, and so we delegated a lot of the very specific technical questions like that to the commission, which would be a bipartisan commission. Politically, it would of course need to be, and we would set forth the mandate of this commission would include the broad parameters such as this, and so they would know what they were trying to do, and maybe so there'd be some pricing specifications as well, and then other things that one has to put into a funding and staffing for commission. So yes, basically the sausage would get made in commission. This would be one example of something the commission could look at to determine, in addition to determining the actual prices assigned to any one variable, you have to determine, well, are we going to put all these variables in there? Is it worth our while? Do we really value commuting time? Do we really value, consumer debt? Is that important to account for? And so this is one possible way they could do that. I won't go into details, but I basically broke it down in terms of impact, accuracy, and feasibility. How much impact would this have on? Would it actually change GDP that much? How accurately can we actually measure it? How advanced have we come in this in terms of the study of the methods to assign a price to this? And how feasible is it going to cost us a lot of money to do?
She hung up. Sorry.
She told us she had to leave.
She said at 4 o'clock she had to leave, so it must be 4.
And so that's so they would use something to this effect to determine A, what goes into this, which variables get included, and B, what prices do we assume. Second one is on institutions. After computing this indicator, so if some commission spits out this new indicator, then how do we get the different institutions involved, which would be many of them, to actually compute it? Turns out the U.S. has a very complex web of statistics when it comes to, or a very complex web of institutions when it comes to the computing of federal statistics. Other countries have a singular cohesive statistics bureau. The United States hasn't. There's pros and cons to that. But for various reasons, we have like the Bureau of Labor Statistics does labor. You've got Census Bureau does a number of things. EPA does a lot of the environmental statistics, but so do some of the other agencies. They have overlapping jurisdictions. So what we decided was we're not going to be able to shove all these statistical agencies together in one fell swoop. So we're going to have them compute the things for which they have over which they have jurisdiction. But then there's the question of, so the EPA computes on the environmental ones, labor computes on the labor ones. But then how do we put them all together? And we did assign the BEA, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, that has always computed GDP, to once again be the one to put this together because they've got the expertise in doing so. And I mean, as I mentioned, this would be new for them, of course. This is they've not done a change in computing anything to the degree of what we're talking about. Yet they have done some change. They have things called satellite accounts, where they've just recently, for example, determined that research and development should be considered investment, not just straight spending, which makes a lot of sense. They slowly, bit by bit, incorporate those things into the indicator. The head of the BEA, we met with the head of the BEA for an hour, the director, and he mentioned that he could see at some point maybe household labor being computed and incorporated in. There's more hesitance about other variables, of course, but it's not improbable that these could be incorporated in by the BEA. And then the question is, well, we want this to really change the narrative, so how do they get reported? The BEA itself would do the reporting, as happens with GDP. Usually the headlines pick that up the very next day, as soon as each quarter after it's out. But also at the end of the year, the Council of Economic Advisors of the President would report it. And the Office of Management and Budget is starting to incorporate new benchmarks for determining policy success, and this could be considered as a new benchmark as well. The third one, and this kind of got interesting this was an interesting part of the research. A surprising coalition, as I mentioned at the beginning, could be supportive of this. There's some social conservatives. So we met with the Heritage Foundation. They would not sign off on this wholesale, or many of the details of it. But we were surprised at the extent to which they were like, yeah, no, we really like to push alternative indicators. There have been various proposals, even in the 1990s, late 80s, from prominent conservatives saying we need to have an index of cultural indicators, of leading cultural indicators to measure the extent to which we have a cultural decline in this country. Now, we're probably never going to agree on cultural indicators, and that's not really what we're going for here. They're like, the divorce rate, for example, was one, and a range of other things. We're looking for more economic oriented indicators. But they do. There is overlap. Household labor. Feminist economists have long pushed this one because of the disproportionate role of women in the house. To value that work, but also the Heritage Foundation was like, well, the extent to which we outsource family cooked dinners and parental care to the market is the extent to which we're outsourcing family values. And as family values go down, GDP should not go up. And so over this, even that very one, that's not the whole project, that's one particular variable, they would actually largely agree that we should assign a value to that. So that was promising. Market-oriented business groups would like to see, and Heritage said this, so did the American Enterprise Institute, assigning some sort of value, as I mentioned, to research and development. Now GDP is calculating that as investment, which is good, but also entrepreneurship. Some things we've heard from several business groups is like, what really makes GDP grow is not really actually ever measured, which is entrepreneurship. At the edges, at the margins, are we innovating? Are we doing new things? We don't have a good way of tracking that, and it would be possible to conceivably to do so. Of course, economic progresses like the whole, the post-Occupy, we need to focus on inequality. And movement would love to see inequality, economic mobility measured. Environmentalists, as is fairly obvious, would have abundant reason to want this. And yet we don't think that we should advance a single measure that only addresses one of these concerns, not only because it wouldn't make sense in terms of what we define welfare to be, but because politically it wouldn't go anywhere. We've seen efforts, there was an effort at green GDP in the early 90s that fell on its face. It was put forth by a number of environmental groups. They signed I don't know if they had a price on carbon in there. Green GDP, by the way, dates back to Simon Kuznets. He thought at the beginning, he actually initially proposed that natural resources be included. So it wasn't carbon, but that the idea that a forest has value should be included. So this is not a radical new concept. This is as old as GDP itself. So this green GDP thing in the 1990s got underway. It actually got it was in Congress. I think it was Gore spoke out in favor of it, and the coal industry shot it down within it was like a week. They they lobbied hard at the representative in Congress and West Virginia representative where I'm from. It killed it. He was in the Appropriations Committee and just basically made sure the thing went to the light of day. And it didn't. So one lesson learned from that is there are going to be some components to this. To override that opposition, you need to have a much broader coalition. Environmentalists alone couldn't push this thing forward, but had they been joined by business groups, had they been joined by social conservatives, you might have seen actually a coalition that had a chance.
Yeah.
So our recommendations in the end were to, just as a quick synopsis of the takeaways for the legislation that we proposed was create a national commission to design the G2 through G5 indicators, interagency task force to calculate and report those indicators, and a diverse political coalition, and we created like talking points, for example, to push this thing forward. All of that resulted in this bill. Since we were working for a congressman, we just essentially submitted that quick rubric, not all the components of the sausage, but a quick rubric to Ledge Council, and they created a bill. So this talks about G2 through G5, talks about the commission, talks about the interagency task force. Basically goes down through what I just said. So here's the, let's see. This is why we're doing this. GDP wasn't originally designed for this. Here's the commission. Here's who's on the commission. What the commission's there for. Here's what they should create. G2, G3, G4, G5. Here's what each one is. Here's some broad parameters for how they should do it. And then here's how the president should take what they do. So that's...
So the purpose of this bill is to get the dialogue started?
Yeah, exactly. It's a messaging bill, yeah. And it's something that, so we can have something to point to and say, here's a proposal on the table. There are other proposals on the table as well, and there's parallel processes. At the state level, a lot is happening, as I mentioned. Maryland pushing this forward, Vermont approving theirs, Institute for Policy Studies, John Talbert, who actually originally co-designed the Genuine Progress Indicator. He's at World Resources Institute. They have been pushing forward a state strategy, and so we're talking with them as well. We're kind of reconvening right now, Justin and I, determine, and along with the congressman who lost his primary actually, so he'll be outgoing, what we want to do with this next. We're we've talked to other offices as well who've expressed interest, and so we're talking to others in Progressive Caucus. The trick is to get this thing. We want it to really be a broad-based effort, so we don't want it to just be sidelined as that's a progressive thing. And so we're discussing what the next best steps would be. So that's pretty much what I've got. But if you have questions, I'd be happy to see what I can do with them.
I thought there was also another group that was working on, and I'm not coming up with their name right now, some kind of progress indicators, like on the West Coast. I can't remember who they are now. So I suppose that there's probably a lot of groups out there.
There was, so Genuine Progress Indicator, I believe, the group was called Redefining Progress, and I believe they were in the Bay Area initially, but they are no more, essentially. But yeah, the 3 people who worked in that was a while ago, that was in the 90s. They put out like a big article on the Atlantic, like that was like the big splash, was proposing this indicator. But then John Talbert, who I just mentioned, the World Resources Institute, worked on it a little more. I did a couple others about them, and they got down to a fairly detailed level of like how you should compute different variables. And then one of the more interesting, actually, the series of interviews we had was with the people in Maryland who were doing this, because that's where the rubber meets the road. And actually, I might be able to bring it up right here. There. Must have changed their site. I don't see the overall graph. Oh, maybe plugins to see it. But here you can see the 26 component parts that they prescribed. These are slightly different from ones we prescribed for a variety of reasons. We restructured them and added a couple and took away a couple. But overall, it's a similar structure. So they have, as well, the 3 main categories. And so theirs doesn't have like a G2, G3, G4, G5. It's just a G2. They smash it all together. And so some of these are current year, some of them are future year. We can go to, let's go. There you go. It doesn't show you so we don't have the plugins, but that one is probably GPI, and then GDP would be going up like this. So they've done a good job. They can just Governor O'Malley he's a real data guy. He likes data, and Maryland is a real strong state of the Chesapeake Bay movement that really propelled like environment to the highest levels of state policymaking. So that combination, combined with an enterprising guy named Sean that decided to put this all together, resulted in GPI actually being implemented. So he basically looked at the model that was created by those redefining progress people. Initially, it's just like a general proposal, and then hashed out to very more detailed sense. Took the details, tried to apply it to Maryland as best as he could, while not deviating a whole lot from it because of what I mentioned of needing to have comparability. Now Vermont is doing largely the same process.
Could you go back to the overview?
Yeah.
I was interested to see when they had the indicators that it seemed under environment, all of them were costs instead of value. I mean, there was no value listed at all.
Where?
Like what you had the categories up there. I guess the indicators maybe.
Oh, cost. Yeah. Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. I would frame that differently. I'm trying to remember how.
Perhaps it's just the concerns in Maryland that define that, but.
Was it in the nature of having to quantify it into like a monetary value in the end?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I guess it's a question of, it's a framing question more than anything. And the equation actually is probably exactly the same way they call it value of the forest or the cost of deforestation.
Right. Okay.
And it's if you wanted to positively frame this, which probably makes somewhat more sense, you would do that. I mean, just flip these around. I can't recall for sure what the specific calculations are for each of these, so I can't be sure of that, but as I recall, that was something we looked at as well and decided to determine to frame them as values, like and actually economic values, because we thought that was also more the language spoken. This is capital,
Right.
It's very real capital.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they do things here that I don't remember, like we didn't differentiate between wetlands or other biomes, for example. We just kind of grouped the biomes together. But then other things that they grouped together, we broke apart. So it depends on. We also had some that I don't know if we like cost of family changes. We didn't really incorporate that. That's divorces, which could be the argument for it wasn't a moral one, or in the sense of like we don't like divorce. It was that you in a divorce tend to have overconsumption because you split. All the kids have to have 2 sets of toys.
Right.
You have 2 cars, 2 houses, 2 blah blah blah. So you should just, if I recall correctly, they just divided by 2 for that, which is probably a really rough.
Yeah.
Very rough.
So there's messiness here. If you dig into the details, it gets messy as to how do you, what is the cost of noise? Like how do you?
Right.
All of it is going to be very messy.
Very messy.
Yeah.
So usually what they do is they don't just pull something out of the air ever. They always had a report, but then the question is, it's an academic report, but then the question is, to what extent did the academic report pull something out of the air? Like, or to what, more likely, to what extent was their study bound by the time and place in which they did it?
Right.
In the same sense that GDP was somewhat bound by 1930s United States. So.
But it's a movement. I mean, it's moving, and that's exciting.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah,
'Cause, I mean,
that's very exciting.
My history is the beginning of the discussions,
Right.
and I imagine there were beginnings before I got involved, but to see where it's come from there is really exciting.
Well, and the number of people who've gotten on board, and at a fairly high level, is pretty impressive. And Stiglitz Commission was a number of high-ranking economists that got on board. So it's less seen as a fringe thing. It's still not exactly mainstream, but it's getting closer.
Yeah.
And it is mainstream in, as I mentioned, a number of European countries.
I'm just gonna grab this postcard that we had. Okay. Well, we have these. The working group put these together. And it was around like Copenhagen and the G20 meeting just before Copenhagen to sort of raise attention to that the GDP really doesn't cut it, and it actually promotes unsustainable consumption.
Yeah.
And then just this past year before Rio Plus 20, we delivered a bunch of those postcards that actually appealed to the United States to sort of at the Rio Plus 20 meeting, sort of get on board with redefining what GDP would look like on a global level, which wasn't a high priority for the United States, but they saw the reason behind it. So it was kind of interesting that it's sort of even being talked about at the UN level, and that people are wrestling with it. I know Bhutan's.
The UN actually approved Bhutan's statement that and recommended that countries begin computing happiness. Like they actually were more out there than like the Stiglitz Commission. I mean, like they were saying, like you should as statistical bureaus, you should be computing a variety of alternative measures, and some of those should be subjective measures.
Yeah.
I'd be more comfortable if they said well-being.
Yeah.
Because, like you said, you could be very unhappy and have there are no connections to anything that you can. Whether it's policy or anything else, it might have to do with personal things. Mostly, often.
There's a portion of this where I talk about all the downsides of
Subjective measures.
Yeah, subjective measures.
Well-being would be somewhat subjective too, but not. To me, happiness is really way up here.
Yeah.
We said that times of economic downturn or like in the economic crisis, suicides go through the roof. So to an extent, I think in the aggregate.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I identified 4 main problems with this accuracy of the subjective measures, even setting aside political questions or so what impact it would have on the narrative. That the first one's the one I mentioned initially, which is just that you're not capturing purely policy relevant aspects. But the second one is that you wait, what was that? That was the second one. What was the first one? Oh, that happiness tends to be really static, and there's a lot of the famous studies show that lottery winners and paraplegics both have extreme deviations from standard happiness at the moment of their tragedy or elation, and then return quickly. I think something like 6 months or something like that. They return quickly to where they were, and so it's a fairly static thing, and so we could be approving and we wouldn't really register, and that would also even for for policymakers who we really support, who are doing all kinds of manner of good things. If we were using this as GDP, then they wouldn't have any sign of success, and they could get voted out of office. So that they would be, if I was a policymaker, I'd be like, oh, I want something that's going to reflect the success we've achieved. And then even if it could only capture policy relevant welfare and wholly capture policy relevant welfare, there's also irrational judgment that goes into surveys, and what time of day did you do it, and how often did you do it. There actually have been some advances in that one, though. It's another reason why we have some momentum now. It's an interesting time. Alan Kruger is the head of the Council of Economic Advisors. Actually, he just stepped down. I think he might have just stepped down. But he was this past year, and he has been one of the pioneers in studying how methodologically we can actually more accurately measure subjective happiness through he proposes taking around these kind of pagers that will at random intervals ring and ask you a series of 5 questions, and you fill those out so as to get rid of the timing thing. So it's completely random. And so in addition to several other measures, so that one might be more doable. But then, in addition to all of that, even if you could erase the marital distress and sports outcomes concerns, the fact that we always return to a static level happiness concerns and the measurability concerns, you'd still not be accounting for future welfare because we're myopic beings and we don't really think about the future when determining how happy we are. Studies have shown. So it's really just not really getting at what we're going for.
Yeah.
There's one other thing. Oh, the other thing I was going to bring up, one interesting thing that came out of the discussions, or some of the most pushback we got from any groups were from environmental groups.
Oh, really?
From progressive environmental groups who saw, and this is a big debate, who saw this as essentially trying to assign value to something that's invaluable. Mm-hmm. How can you say the river is worth this much, or a forest is worth this much, or clean air is worth that much? That essentially means that if you could come up with a subdivision that was worth more economically, then you have an economic argument to justify its construction. Mm-hmm. And the depletion of the environment, which is a valid concern, and mm-hmm. we're not going to throw that out of the water. Our response to that, though, is that the value right now ascribed to that river, that air pollution, etc., is the clean air is zero. That it's not on the map, mm-hmm. and so we need to start. I go back to the premise we operated with it, which is that which gets measured gets done, and we get what we measure, and so we feel maybe that's not the best way humans should ideally operate, but it's the policymaking world in which we've been handed, and so we've intentionally chosen here to operate within it. There are those certainly broad swaths of the environmental movement who would say, some of my colleagues, even in global development environment at Tufts University, push back some of the hardest. They're just no, this is the wrong direction. Mm-hmm. It's the idea of quantifying everything is what's wrong with the world, and we should not be seeking to assign more numbers, assign less, and just simply say it's invaluable. Don't build that subdivision.
Yeah.
For us, that's less of a pragmatic view, and it's not going to really change the conversation. But I can see why it has. That's the IPS is actually, I think, hosting a debate sometime soon, essentially on that question of what do you do with environmental goods.
Yeah, very interesting question, because I mean, people who have been sort of at it for a long time still fight about that question.
Yeah.
You know, and then, I mean, like Bill McKibben now is really saying, yes, let's get a price, because if we don't have a price, they'll keep trouncing on the environment. But other people just feel like there's a price on everything and it's gone too far. So I mean, it is, and even for like faith-based people, it's a big question too.
It is. You'd have to go back to everything.
Yeah.
If you did that. I mean, I can see both sides of it, so I'm not going to start.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I can too. Like, I've definitely been at several points argued the other side as well. That we shouldn't. The problem is quantification. The problem, and that's the problem with GDP. But like, I don't know. I've just become too indoctrinated of a values guy. I believe we should assign values to that which we value. If values, numerical ones, drive our policy. I'm trying to think of those other unresolved big questions you might find interesting.
And so, like, for the Maryland state, I was aware that it is operating. Do you know how long they've had it in place?
2000. Here, let me go back to the chart.
Thank you.
It's somewhere on this chart. I just can't seem to find it. Stiglitz Commission's 2008. Oh, maybe it's not on the chart.
Yeah, and I thought the Stiglitz Commission was sort of in response to the General Assembly trying to wrestle with the economic crisis.
It was well, some people cynically have said it was in response to Sarkozy's political problems, and that he essentially needed to show that his country was better off than GDP would have reflected.
Yeah.
And to basically counter his opposition, and he's had it. I mean, from the left, he's being really, given a run for his money from the left. So he, this was kind of like pushed by the progressive movements in France, and so he's like, look, I stand behind this as well. And so he commissioned Stiglitz and Amartya Sen and Flaubert, how do you pronounce his name, to be part of the commission. Flaubert. I'll go up here to look at the date on the.
I apologize, but I have to go.
Okay.
And Kathy, I think I lost an earring.
Okay.
It looks like that. It's like that Peruvian bird.
Oh, yeah.
So if you find it.
Okay. I will let you know. Should we look around in the parking lot too?
I will. Don't pay.
Thanks for coming, Susan.
Yeah, it's been really interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
No problem. Thanks for coming.
Appreciate it.
Just keep your eyes on.
The whole way.
Yeah. Anyway, I think it was the last couple of years. I don't.
Okay.
For some reason, have to.
Well, it couldn't be before Martin O'Malley, but it's just interested to see if it has had an impact on Maryland state policy.
Right. That I don't think we know yet.
Yeah.
Because I think I think it was like 2010. I would
Okay.
say 2009 was like first commission. Like they're like, we're gonna do this thing. It was unveiled,
Yeah.
and I think the numbers started coming out in 2010 because we were
Okay.
starting in 2011. Yeah. So it's too new. We can't yet see. This is. I mean, that's one of the big questions. I mean, we had spent some time just basically defending our premise here that like this is actually going to matter. Like say we got a number, and here we're saying like through these arrows that number 3 we're changing the narrative that actually does matter.
Right.
And for that we use things like the fact that we use like the labor example with U6. Romney has been beaten up on U6 all year long.
Yeah.
Every time job numbers come out, he's like, yeah, Obama says he can create new jobs, but look at U6, it's gone up, and people are just abandoning the workforce, and like, which shows that actually has been brought into the narrative. 5 would indicate just a direct, like, our policies need to match, need to show growth in this indicator. And that's not been done historically very much, but there is, I'm not sure if I can find where exactly we talk about this, but the OMB, I believe, I'm trying to remember where we talk about this. Yeah, their Office of Management and Budget is started something called the Government Performance and Results Act in 2010. And it's the purpose of that act was to require the office to establish outcome-oriented whole-of-government goals, which was, the idea was to have basically a more cohesive government policy, but like to have goals, have like numerical goals every 4 years. And so the new indicators we proposed could serve as those goals, or could influence those goals. The other thing that's been interesting advancement was what you mentioned at the beginning, the State of the USA, which just was going to create this dashboard. Theirs was actually going to be a dashboard of like some 200 indicators. And they've got, they've started it. I've actually got access to the online site. They've started it, but they just and it got approved by Congress as part of the healthcare bill. Actually, it was this like writer essentially that said, we're gonna create this thing, and they had basically like a bipartisan commission, and so you have members of American Enterprise Institute on there, and it's housed in the National Academy of Sciences, and we talked to various members of the commission, as well as the National Academy of Sciences. National Academy is really hopeful and saying like, yeah, we want to push this thing forward, and we think we are real engaging, excited about this. We said more power to you. That is great.
Yeah.
It wasn't exactly the model we pushed because we think it more an aggregate rather than a dashboard. But yeah, it's great. But then the thing never got appropriated, so they never funded it. So they're actually the American Enterprise Institute guy told us apparently it's tantamount to treason to start a committee that has not been appropriated. So it's illegal for us to meet. So they're not allowed to, so it's apparently a serious crime, so we're not going to meet. So they haven't gotten their work started yet. Who knows if it ever will get appropriated. It's hard to tell also if that was more of like just the general budget crunching milieu that we're in, or if it was explicitly like we don't like alternative indicators and this is leading that direction. I don't actually, or if it was just
or
oversight.
We don't like the health bill, so let's take
That's true.
the
pieces
we can.
Yeah. But anyway, it's efforts like that I mean, again, to quote the American Enterprise Institute guy, who I don't often quote, he was just like, this is like motherhood and apple pie. I mean, like the idea of just having more data is like, it's hard to reject that.
Right.
Of course, once you get down to the details, the devil is in them, and that's people will reject it. But and there'll be many debates to be had. But our point is essentially we shouldn't avoid those debates. Those are precisely the debates we should be having.
Right.
What value do we ascribe to this? So anyway, it would be messy, but such is democracy.
Yeah, it's true. Thank you for sharing
No
that.
problem.
It's really great that you've spent so much time thinking about it.
I'm looking forward to seeing where we go from here. I think I'm interested in checking in a little more with the IPS folks about their state strategy and seeing where that goes. And if there can be some sort of parallel thing at the federal level, which is more where we focus our efforts at the same time. We would, of course, like to make sure we're meshing with other existing efforts.
Right.
And it'll be interesting as well to try to bring in this broader coalition than the usual partners we're used to working with. Actually, for me, it's one of the more exciting things, like to actually be in the Heritage Foundation and find some common ground was
right.
kind of interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
I was like, wow. And I think they were a little baffled and interested as well. So anyway, again, this not to smooth over the conflicts that will arise, but I think there's ground to build on.
Yeah, I think it's great. Yeah, well, thank you.
No problem. I can, if you like either of these, I could just download them here, I suppose.
Oh yeah, that would be great.
Let me go
Share
back
them with the working group. I think they'd appreciate it.